Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really fascinating but kind of morally complex story today. Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, it's one of those things you hear about, but there's so much more to it
Right.
than most people realize.
So picture this. 1945, World War II's just ended,
Right.
and the U.S. and the Soviets, they're in this race, right?
Mm-hmm.
To grab all this German scientific knowledge. We're talking rockets, aviation, medicine, you name it.
It wasn't just about the knowledge itself, though. I mean, the U.S. really wanted the brains behind it.
The scientists themselves.
Exactly. The engineers, the technicians,
Yeah.
the people who'd made Germany such a, well, technological powerhouse, even with, everything the Nazi regime was doing.
It's kind of crazy to think about. Over 1,600 of these folks were brought to the U.S., and a lot of them, they had ties to the Nazi Party.
Yeah, that's the part that makes it so tricky. Scientific breakthroughs, but this unavoidable ethical shadow hanging over it all.
And I read somewhere that, the U.S. saw these scientists as almost like a financial asset.
Oh, absolutely. Billions of dollars, that's what they figured all those patents and industrial processes were worth.
Billions. Wow.
So it was like a scientific gold rush.
So it's obvious the U.S. saw this as, a strategic move in the Cold War. They had to compete with the Soviets, and science and tech, that was the battleground.
For sure. And it wasn't just about keeping up. They wanted to be better, to surpass them.
Okay, so let's back up a bit.
Yeah.
How did this whole thing even get started?
Well, as the Allies were closing in on Germany, they found this list, the Ausenberg list.
Olsenberg?
Yeah, it was compiled by the Nazis. Can you believe it?
No way.
Listing all their top scientists and engineers, the ones they thought were most important to their war effort.
So the Nazis basically gave the Allies a cheat sheet. That's wild.
Well, it's not that straightforward. There's this story about a Polish lab technician who was working with these documents, and get this, he hid some of the most important papers in a toilet.
A toilet? You're kidding.
Seriously. When the Allies arrived, he was able to get them back and pass them along.
Like something out of a spy film.
Right.
Okay, but even with the list, how did they get these scientists to come to America?
You got to remember what it was like back then. Germany was devastated. A lot of these scientists, they were facing a really uncertain future. They weren't too keen on the Soviets, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's even a quote from some captured German engineers, and they basically said, "We hate the French, we're terrified of the Soviets, and we don't think the British can afford us."
Leaving only one option.
Exactly. So it was partly U.S. maneuvering, partly the scientists just trying to survive.
Makes sense. So we can't talk about this without mentioning Wernher von Braun, right?
Oh, definitely. A fascinating guy, but complicated. Brilliant rocket scientist, but also he developed the V-2 rocket for Germany during the war.
And those were built using forced labor.
Right. Can't forget that part.
And then he ends up at NASA, heading the Marshall Space Flight Center, developing the Saturn V.
The rocket that took us to the moon. It makes you think, doesn't it? From weapons of war to one of humanity's biggest achievements.
It's quite the turnaround. But von Braun wasn't the only important figure, right? There were others who maybe aren't as famous.
Oh, for sure. Like Adolf Busemann. His work on supersonic flight, it really changed aviation.
I know it's a big deal, but the science behind it, I've never quite understood it.
Well, think about it this way. As a plane gets close to the speed of sound, the air flowing over the wings, it gets really messed up, creates massive drag. Busemann, he had this breakthrough, realized that by angling the wings back, you could kind of trick the airflow.
So that's how planes break the sound barrier.
Exactly. And he started that research in Germany way before Operation Paperclip. He was already pushing the boundaries of flight.
So he brought all that expertise to the U.S., helped develop some of America's most iconic supersonic planes.
Yep. And most people probably don't even know a German scientist played such a big role in American aviation.
Okay, so Operation Paperclip, it clearly had a huge impact on U.S. science. But there's the ethical side too, right? We're talking about people who were at least complicit in a really terrible regime.
That's the real dilemma, isn't it? How do you balance that desire for progress with the fact that, well, these people were part of something horrific?
Yeah, that's a tough...
Definitely something we need to keep in mind as we go deeper into this.
I'm looking forward to it.
It really is a tightrope walk, trying to balance that potential for scientific advancement with the moral compromises that might have been made.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how did the U.S. deal with that tension?
Well, gotta remember, the Cold War was in full swing. The U.S. saw those German scientists as a way to get an edge over the Soviets.
So basically, winning the Cold War trumped everything else.
To a certain extent, yeah. The government decided that national security and scientific progress, that was the priority, even if it meant kind of overlooking some things in these scientists' past.
Did they even, like, properly vet these guys? How can they be sure they weren't bringing in hardcore Nazis?
The vetting process, yeah, it wasn't exactly perfect. Some people slipped through the cracks who were more involved with the Nazi regime than they initially let on.
And that led to some major blowback later on, right?
Big time. Like the case of Arthur Rudolph.
Brutal.
He was a brilliant engineer key to the Saturn V rocket, but his past at Middlework.
Oh, right, where they used slave labor to build the V-2 rocket.
Exactly. He was the operations director there.
That's heavy stuff. Did he ever, like, show any remorse for that?
It's hard to say. He always claimed he was just focused on the engineering, tried to distance himself from the whole forced labor thing.
But can you really separate the two? I mean, those rockets were literally built on the backs of those slave laborers.
It's a tough question. Rudolph ended up renouncing his U.S. citizenship, went back to Germany rather than face potential war crimes charges. It shows you how long the shadow of Operation Paperclip lingered. All these achievements, but this darkness hanging over them.
It's kind of a sobering thought. So it seems like with Operation Paperclip, you can't really celebrate the science without acknowledging the dark side.
You got it. It reminds us that history's messy. It's not always a clear-cut good versus evil thing.
Speaking of which, there's another figure from Operation Paperclip who became pretty controversial, Hubertus Struvhold.
Ah, yes. The father of space medicine.
But, like, his story takes a dark turn too, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. Struckhold's work was super important for human spaceflight. He was the one figuring out how altitude, acceleration, weightlessness, all that, how it affects the body. Essential stuff for making space travel possible.
So he's making these groundbreaking discoveries, but
But after he died, these allegations came out linking him to Nazi human experiments during the war.
you mean like experiments on prisoners?
Yeah. Subjecting them to horrible conditions, often leading to death.
It's hard to wrap your head around that. Here's this guy pushing the boundaries of space medicine, but also potentially involved in these horrific acts.
Right. It really makes you think, can you separate the science from the scientist? Can you appreciate someone's contributions while still condemning the terrible things they might have done?
That's a question that goes way beyond Operation Paperclip. It pops up all the time, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're looking back at historical figures.
Totally. It forces us to confront our own values, you know? How do we balance scientific progress with moral responsibility?
So we've talked about the big names, but what about the everyday scientists and engineers? What was it like for them coming to America?
Must have been a huge culture shock. Imagine leaving everything behind, your home, your language, your way of life.
And then there's the whole psychological aspect.
Yeah.
Even if they weren't, directly involved in the Nazi atrocities, they were still part of that system.
Absolutely. They were carrying that history with them. Makes you wonder how they dealt with it, how they reconciled their past with their new lives.
Did they ever talk about their experiences? Express regret?
There are some memoirs and biographies out there written by people who were part of Operation Paperclip. It'd be fascinating to read those, to hear their stories firsthand.
Yeah, to understand how they made sense of it all, how they adapted, the challenges they faced.
It would definitely add a whole new layer to our understanding of Operation Paperclip, to go beyond the politics and the science, to see the human side of it.
So before we go too far down that road, let's come back to the legacy of Operation Paperclip. How should we view it today? Is it a success story, a cautionary tale, or somewhere in between?
Honestly, I think it's all of those things. We can't deny the huge impact these German scientists had on American science and tech. They helped make the U.S. a leader in so many fields.
But those advancements, they didn't come cheap. The U.S. government chose to prioritize winning the Cold War, even if it meant turning a blind eye to some pretty disturbing things.
And that decision, it still sparks debate today. It asks us, what price are we willing to pay for progress? Are there lines we shouldn't cross, even for the sake of knowledge?
It's a question with no easy answers, but it's one we need to keep asking, right? The legacy of Operation Paperclip isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make today.
I agree. And it reminds us that history isn't just dates and events. It's about people, their stories, their choices, and how those choices continue to shape the world we live in.
Well said. And speaking of people's stories, there's one more aspect of Operation Paperclip I think we should touch on.
Oh, I'm all ears.
It turns out that Operation Paperclip wasn't all about rockets and space. They also recruited scientists from other fields, including medicine.
Makes sense. Medical knowledge would have been valuable after the war, especially with the Cold War heating up.
Exactly. And one of the most prominent figures in that area was Hubertus Struholt, the father of space medicine.
Trohold, yeah. His research on the effects of spaceflight on the human body was crucial. It helped lay the groundwork for spacesuits, life support systems, all that stuff that makes space travel possible.
You go. There's a shadow hanging over his story, too, isn't there?
Yeah, unfortunately. After Struhold died, there were these allegations that he was involved in Nazi human experiments during World War II.
Experiments on prisoners, right?
Sadly, yes. They said he knew about and maybe even participated in research where prisoners were subjected to extreme conditions, often resulting in death.
It's hard to believe someone who made such important contributions to science could also be involved in something so horrific.
I know. It raises those same tough questions we've been grappling with. How do we reconcile the good with the bad? Can we separate the science from the scientist?
It's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge should never come at the expense of human life and dignity. The ends don't justify the means, especially when those means involve such suffering and exploitation.
I couldn't agree more. It's a dark chapter, but one we can't afford to forget.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dives into Operation Paperclip.
It's been a fascinating journey, that's for sure. Full of twists and turns.
Definitely. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, I'm listening.
We've talked a lot about the ethical side of Operation Paperclip from the American perspective, but what about the German scientists themselves? How did they come to terms with their past, with starting new lives in America?
That's a really interesting perspective. We haven't really touched on that much.
Yeah, these were people uprooted from their homes, sometimes separated from their families, thrust into a completely new culture.
And they were carrying the weight of their involvement, however direct or indirect, with the Nazi regime.
How did they process all that? How did they deal with the moral implications? Did they seek redemption? Did they regret what happened?
I don't know if we have all the answers, but it's definitely something to ponder.
And it reminds us that history is made up of individual stories, each person with their own unique experience.
Exactly. Maybe by exploring those individual stories, by trying to understand the human side of this complex chapter, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the lasting impact of Operation Paperclip. Not just on science and technology, but on the lives of those who were caught in the middle of it all.
Well said. And with that thought-provoking question, I think we'll leave it to our listeners to continue exploring.
Until next time, keep digging.
Yeah, trying to imagine what that must have been like for them, to have all that skill, all that knowledge, but also that past.
Right. It's like you're given this opportunity, a chance to keep doing the work you love, maybe even make some amazing discoveries.
Yeah.
But you can't escape the fact that you were part of this regime, this system that did such awful things.
I wonder if they ever saw it as a chance to, make amends,
Mm-hmm.
like using their talents for good to kind of balance out the bad.
That's an interesting thought. I bet it varied from person to person,
Yeah.
Some might have been totally haunted by their past, while others might have convinced themselves they were doing something positive now.
I wish we could read, their diaries or letters from that time.
Oh, yeah.
To really get inside their heads, see how they were feeling, how their views changed, if they did.
Totally. I mean, those primary sources, that's where the real story is.
And what about the American scientists who worked with them? Were they, suspicious?
I'd imagine so, at least at first.
Right.
But maybe over time that faded. I mean, science can be a powerful common ground,
True. It would be fascinating to know how those relationships developed, though.
Yeah.
Did their different approaches to science, to research, did those clash at all?
Good question.
Or did they learn from each other? It makes me wonder about the long-term impact of Operation Paperclip.
Mm.
I mean, we've talked about the immediate stuff, the rockets, the technology, but did it also change the way science is done in America?
Ooh, that's a really interesting idea.
Right. Did those German scientists bring not just their knowledge, but also their whole way of thinking, their methods, their philosophy of science?
It's like a ripple effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Spreading out from those early years. So Operation Paperclip isn't just a historical event. It's kind of woven into the fabric of American science.
And I guess it shows that science is never really neutral, right?
Yeah.
It's always influenced by the people doing it, by the time and place they're in.
Exactly. It's a human endeavor, after all.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into Operation Paperclip, It feels like we've uncovered more questions than answers.
That's often how it goes, though, isn't it? The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah, but that's what makes it so fascinating, right? It makes you want to keep digging, keep learning.
For sure.
And that's what I hope we've achieved today, to give everyone a good overview of Operation Paperclip, the who, the what, the why, and all those ethical questions that come with it.
Yeah, and we've just scratched the surface, really.
Exactly. There's so much more to explore. And I think the most intriguing part is those personal stories. Trying to understand what it was like for those scientists and engineers who were part of it all.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners, I'd say keep digging into those stories. Read those memoirs, those biographies. Try to see the world through their eyes.
Because in the end, it's those individual stories, those human experiences that really bring history to life.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, folks, it's been a pleasure diving deep with you today.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.